Hi, I'm Rossano, here with our second installment of Conversations. I'm joined today by Seema Shah to really go through an in-depth dive into retail and the consumer. So we started to look at this and we started to talk about it, and we've gotten a lot of great feedback and people wanted to go deeper. So I couldn't think of anyone better to bring on than Seema to really take us into the head of the consumer and really what she's seeing. So after a brief introduction, we can jump right into some of the information.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, everyone. This is Seema Shah. I'm the Director of Retail and Consumer Trends at Credit Intel. Credit Intel is a premier independent consulting and research firm focused on the retail and consumer sector. Our team of over 20 analysts has extensive experience and deep knowledge of the retail sector, which we leverage in conjunction with our proprietary credit scoring models and data analytics to provide research on the financial health of private and publicly held retailers and the broader industry. We also overlay our analysis with secular and macroeconomic trends. This has been particularly important for our clients during this volatile period during COVID, as we were able to provide them with the information necessary to make their business decisions, and in many cases, provided early signs and warnings to help them avoid pitfalls with retailers who eventually succumb to bankruptcy. Our parent company has a number of businesses, including ag data, Thassos mobile location data, innovative mapping technology, and other proprietary data and tools, such as our retail tracker, where we can monitor store openings and closings and can provide void and overlap analysis. Our clients include retailers, manufacturers, landlords, and investors. With a subscription to Credit Intel, you'll have access to comprehensive analysis of retailers' financial condition and our expert analytics team. Visit creditintel.com for more info.
Now, what are you seeing? What are the trends? What are we going to talk about? What are you excited about? What are the problems you're seeing? And let's just kind of kick off with the positive here.
Yeah, that's a pretty broad question. So I'll start with the positive. I guess from a channel perspective, the main thing that we've really seen, obviously, is the shift to e-commerce. Due to COVID, we had the shutdown of most of the United States and most retail. So that naturally shifted sales online. I think that trend, that penetration will continue even as stores reopen, because it introduced online to a new consumer in many cases who hadn't even thought of buying grocery, for example, online. So I think that is definitely one trend we'll see in terms of the channel. But I also think that we'll still continue to see how important the actual physical store is. Because people want to be able to go into a store. Sometimes you need a product immediately, and we can discuss it later, but we know what happened with Amazon and their supply chain. They couldn't get the product out fast enough. So really the biggest takeaway is that, look, you need to have an omni-channel strategy if you want to be competitive today in the retail environment. And this goes for small companies as well, the mom and pop shops. I think they realize that at this time.
You bring up an interesting point with the e-commerce, and you're starting to see some of these smaller businesses try to branch out. I mean, is there someone that is providing some of that bandwidth? Is it Amazon? Is it eBay? Or is there someone that's kind of a startup trying to take some of this market share or build some of the market share to really kind of help these smaller businesses get onto the e-commerce platform?
Well, I think from a public company standpoint, I know we have Shopify, and I think there's another company called BigCommerce where they can help you create an e-commerce website. But separately, you can, if you're a small retailer, go onto marketplace sites like Amazon or Walmart where you can sell your product and at least get you perhaps a new, a customer that may not have heard of you before. But, there are also some risks with that. You have to follow the rules of the marketplace. So in the case of Amazon, you weren't able to send non-essential merchandise during the pandemic. And you may have to pay up if you want to get the right placement on the screen when they do a search. But still, that's probably the best way for a small company to get out there. But I think over time, you need to have your own website for sure, because that's the first thing that people look for. And even at this point, I'd say it's necessary to have a mobile app.
Okay. Now, when you're talking about getting on some of these areas and getting into the best placement, I mean, how much margin are you usually giving up or sharing in terms of getting that premium slot?
Yeah, I guess it would depend on where you want to be positioned, but I kind of think of it as a typical wholesale model where Amazon being the wholesaler, so they'll probably take their usual cut, which I guess it just really depends on where you want to be placed, but it's significantly less margin than having a direct website or direct consumer access and sales, because you don't have to give up anything.
Now, when you're looking at, you talked about COVID-19 and how that really kind of shook the world in terms of where, supply chain, just where people were going, how they were purchasing. I mean, how much have you seen normalizing? Have you seen an increase in retail traffic? Are people still a little skittish and they're still kind of staying within the e-commerce, or is it kind of a mixture of both in terms of seeing this adjustment in the way people are purchasing?
I think I would say it's a mixture. You are seeing people return to shopping, and we can discuss this later, but a lot of it, I think, has to do with the stimulus and pent-up demand. They had been at home for like 6 weeks, so they're spending. But how are they spending? A lot of it is still online, because most retailers, to the extent possible, offered buy online, pick up in store, or curbside pickup. So that's sort of a mix of being in the store and online, and it's very convenient. So you're still seeing a lot of that. I do think you're seeing people go into the store, maybe more comfortable in stores that they've been going to, like the mass merchants or the grocers. But I know the other discretionary retailers are trying to make the environment more appealing by, letting people know how often they're sanitizing, maybe metering customers so the stores don't get that crowded, and different things like that to get people to get back in the store, because that's really where you get the impulse buys and where you can start to build that loyalty from the customer.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously we had a huge drop off just because, you had lockdowns, you have different things. So you have that pent up demand. But when we look at the bounce off the bottom, I mean, what are you guys thinking about? How are you looking at, like, where do we hit a ceiling? Is there a point where we really get back to normal? Or is there going to be some kind of middle ground in terms of what do you think is kind of the new normal throughout the rest of, let's just say, 2020?
In terms of consumer spending?
Consumer spending and traffic.
Yeah, I would say for consumer spending, I think that even though it's a little elevated right now from the bottom during the pandemic, I think that it will start tapering off as we get to the back half of summer. Okay. Just because, any unemployment benefits, federal unemployment benefits, they'll end at the end of the month. We still have a high number of people who are unemployed, and many cases, those people were wage earners, so may not have the capacity or the savings to continue to spend as we go forward. So I'm a little concerned about how they'll be able to spend, or if we'll see spending, but it's on credit. And maybe you'll see an increase in credit spend. For the retailer perspective, I think it depends by sector. So many of them were closed during spring. So I think any seasonal merchandise, there'll be a lot of extreme promotions in the next few months in order to prepare for back to school and subsequently holiday. Many of them, to the extent possible, pulled back on inventory for holiday. So I don't think demand will be as robust as it was last year, but maybe it won't be as detrimental to the retailers if they're able to manage their inventory. Okay. But from a broader perspective, I think that, to make these sales, it's going to be promotion based and margin dilutive.
Right. So when you talk about promotions, one of the interesting things that we were looking at is, even though you had retail traffic going up and you had card spending going up, you had, total quantity essentially going down. And that's it just seems like everywhere you look, it's like get 50% off, then an extra 30% off in store. And it just seems like these are kind of things to move inventory, but also to get people in the store. And once you start giving that kind of incentive, I mean, how long is that going to take before you can actually start pulling some of that back?
I would argue that since 2008, we haven't been able to pull it back. Right. Consumers are very deal oriented. And now it's even moved away from the holiday period. You have things like Amazon Prime Day, Wayfair's Way Day, where these retailers have created these holidays that basically pull forward sales to them into the summer or whatever quarter they want it to be. But really, you're just pulling forward from the holiday. Similarly, Black Friday and all these type of promotions start in October. So consumers are very used to that. And now you have apps like Retail Me Not and other things where you can find coupons immediately. And I think it's very difficult to get a consumer to really pay full price unless it's something where there's a huge scarcity of it. But I would say for most categories, people are looking for deals. And if you don't have those kind of deals, they'll look somewhere else. And that part of those deals could even be free shipping. That is considered a promotion in a sense, but it's almost like mandatory at this point. You need to have something to get the consumer to come in or to spend.
Yeah. And the biggest thing is always have a dollar amount in your bucket in order, or in your shopping cart to get that promotion. So when you're looking at trends and you're giving this advice to both the buy side, but also to your clients in the retail sector, I mean, what kind of trends do you follow, or do you think people should follow to say like, hey, this is getting a lot better. This is going to be good for the retailer, maybe the consumption of gasoline? Or is there something where you're looking at and saying, look, this is a false positive, but it's something that has to be tracked on a go-forward basis?
So I am very concerned with the actual strength of the consumer, how wealthy they really are. And so I think a lot of the metrics we look at on a macro basis, which I follow, even retail sales, which is month over month, that's the way it's used by the street, versus year over year. Sometimes they look overly positive, I think, than what they should be. Similarly, because everything was shut down, savings rate went up. Personal savings rate was very high. But that's just, to me, it's on a relative basis, but it doesn't tell you the number of consumers that really don't have that extra cash to spend if there's an emergency. And you see stats like that. So for me, I'm really concerned about, I would say, the household debt and an overall income and actual capacity to spend, because for the millennials in particular, they're the largest demographic out there. They came of age, so to speak, in the Great Recession, and now this is sort of like a second hit for them. So if you look at that, if you assume that your income compounds, they're at a deficit compared to prior generations. So I think you have to keep that in mind when you think about how they might spend on big ticket items like homes and cars, but also what capacity they can spend on discretionary.
Right.
That makes sense.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting because when you talk about the year over year, month over month, the bulls were sitting there saying, oh, well, month over month, it's great. It's like, well, we were locked down for 2 months. Like month over month is going to be great, but year over year is kind of the real calculation when you average in the seasonality, the different adjustments. The thing that you talk about, which I always think is missed, is the savings rates. And really what we're looking at when we look at Powell sitting there printing and telling everyone that, who really cares about the saver as long as you have assets. So when we look at people who don't have assets, who are asset poor and have to rely on savings, then all of a sudden, like when you talk about millennials not buying homes or not having those assets, you're going to have this deflationary cycle. And when you're talking to some of these companies that are looking to come up with 5-10 year plans, I mean, what kind of advice are you giving them? What are you seeing as the trend to try to mitigate against some of these disasters that seem to be coming down the pike?
I think so much of it has to do with being a relevant brand. So if I was going to talk to an up and coming brand or retailer, I think that in the past, people maybe had a broad target audience. Maybe, way back in the 90s, there were category killers and there really weren't very many options for consumers. But that is not the case today. And I don't think that, broadly speaking, consumers have the brand loyalty that maybe some of the earlier generations had. So I think it's really, the brand has to have a distinct point of view and make that clear to their relevant customer, because there's so much coming at people nowadays. I mean, with Instagram and social media, that you have to be top of mind and you have to have that mind share. So to me, that's the most important. So if you decide your customer is a 35-year-old male, where are you going to find them? How are you going to get to them? So when they think of your product, you're the first place that they go and they don't just go to what's most convenient. And I think that's what you need to do. Because in many cases, a lot of these brands have had turnaround, many of them that have gone into bankruptcy, but the brand itself wasn't strong enough to come out from its past, reputation, so to speak. Right. And that's really why they could never come back. So I think that's one of the most important things.
So when you're thinking about this brand focus and this shift to e-commerce, I mean, what happens to the mall? What happens to the strip mall? What happens to these, the Tanger outlets of the world? Like, is it something where we're going to see a shift, the malls go away, or do they have to change in the way that they're structured?
Probably both. I think there's about over 1,000 malls in the United States right now. So we categorize them, A being the best, C and D being not so good. So I think most of the A and B malls have turned over their tenants and improved the experience enough that they'll continue to be fine and do well. They have good locations. Some of the C&D malls, I think, are where we're more at risk. Maybe they weren't in the best locations, or they were anchored by companies that are themselves struggling, let's say Sears or JCPenney, and those types of boxes are going to be very hard to fill. But I don't think that you see the shopping center as a whole go away. It just could be that for the enclosed malls, you need to have either the best location, the best tenants, or you have to have some great experiences, whatever that may be, restaurants, gyms, indoor skydiving. But the outdoor strip centers, I think they've actually done quite well because they're already set up for retailers to start to implement some of these different fulfillment options that are better margin for them and more convenient for the consumer, such as curbside pickup, even the buy online, pickup in store. And in many cases, at least for the summer period, they're already set for restaurants to have outdoor seating. So you're starting to get some capacity back. So they are actually in much better shape. And a lot of them are anchored by grocery, which was very strong in the last few months.
Now, when you're talking about curbside and some of these adjustments, what does the employment needs change? Do they change? Do you still need 5 people on the sales floor, or can you have one person on the sales floor, 3 people in the back, and all of a sudden you've lost, 1 or 2 employees per store? Is there a chance to see a shift in the way the employment is happening as people kind of adjust their models to address, like you said, curbside, strip malls outside, implementing some of these issues? Or do you have that extra person sitting there disinfecting as people come in and out? How does that look in terms of just that employment on the people inside the store? Right.
Well, the sanitation part, it's still very new, but I think that will be an added cost that we just have to assume across basically every business at this point right now. So it's hard for me to quantify that, but I think that the level of staffing in a store is going to be dependent on the way the store is set up and the amount of technology that's already been implemented into the store. So many stores are just now adding these type of in-store fulfillments, and they may need to do remodels actually to have pick and pack in the back of the store, have a special place where you have buy online, pick up in store orders, and then you have a separate sales force just focused on in-store customers. It's a different layout. It doesn't work as efficiently if you have one guy running to pick up something and at the same time having to run out and help a customer. So I think the more automation the associates have in terms of, like mobile POS so that they can check people out as they're going in, or even the mobile PS so they can come to the car and say, okay, Mark, here's your order. It's right there and it's ready. It's faster. I think they need to do that, but it'll take time before you get that completely efficient model.
And, when you talked about, a lot of these since 2008, you've seen these sales be necessary, but yet you have these additional costs that are being incurred. I mean, is there any way to really move that cost either to the consumer or back up the supply chain to tell guys like, look, I'm getting killed on margin. You need to take some of the pain too. Or has that already kind of been maxed out and now you're just going to see margin compression, above what we've already seen?
Some of it, I think, honestly, has been maxed out. We had the issue of the tariffs with China, and that immediately forced a bunch of retailers to go back to their vendors and suppliers and say, you have to share this pain with me. Because the problem for a majority of retailers is that they cannot push price through. So in order to even maintain their margins, they got to get some concession from their vendors. So a lot of that, I think, has already been done. So it's just either about how else can you improve the cost of the product manufacturing. So some of that has been to change your supply chain, country diversification, or, different things like that. Or I think to have more optimized, marketing and labor spend. But it's really hard for them to cut costs at this point, I think, broadly speaking. There's always a little bit of fat that they can trim, but big buckets need to be spent. Like you have to have marketing, have to have advertising, and you need the labor. So it's really, where else can you get it? Can you get it from your landlords? That's what people are trying to do now, right? Push back on rent and things like that.
I mean, how much additional pain can some of these landlords actually take in terms of what's been given up when we look at like Simon Malls and some of these other big conglomerates? It just seems like they've kind of maxed out what they're able to, because they think of it, they've leveraged themselves to build additional capacity, and they've never really capitalized on that since. So how much can they really give up in terms of what they're willing to sacrifice?
Yeah, so I think during the peak of the pandemic, they really were negotiating with their retailers because it's better to have some sort of retailer there than a dark box. And I think what a lot of them have done is defer the rent that retailers missed into 2021.
Okay.
So to kind of ease them into it and maintain, the tenant capacity that they've had. But I would say that a lot of the landlords that we've spoken to have seen an improvement in rent payments as we've gotten into June.
Okay.
And it really depends on category. Like grocery was paying 80 to 90% anyway during the peak of the pandemic, but other discretionary categories are starting to catch up and to start to pay that back. But there's not so much room for these landlords either, because I think there's one CBL, like they are at risk because they couldn't pay their interest payments because their tenants didn't pay. So it's a very, they both need each other. So they have to balance out how much push and pull that they have. But I think they were trying to do that the last few months.
Right. Now, just to look at the global, because you mentioned China and a lot of these tariffs and things that have happened. And obviously, global tensions continue to rise. But we started to see a shift away from China, even let's call it 10 years ago, going into Cambodia, Indonesia, India. Does that accelerate? Is that something that you're going to see more of as things start to kind of heat up a little bit? Or is it something where they're so ingrained it would be too costly at this point to even think about moving countries that haven't done so already?
Right. I think that when the tariffs came about, it was too fast for many of these retailers to just move their supply. But they were already in the process of diversification of countries. So I think you will see that continue, because really initially everybody had everything in China and it was just too much of that eggs in one basket. So I think that as retailers get back into some sort of normalized mode, they will try to diversify their supply so that they're not relying on any one country. Because global political issues, as you know, we don't know exactly what's going to happen when. So I think the best defense for them is to be more diversified. And I think you'll continue to see that happen.
Okay. I mean, what country do you think is, or have you seen or heard people talk about the most to see some of this new flow coming out of, say, China or some of the others, and could see a decent pickup?
Vietnam has been one that has been mentioned a while. You mentioned India.
Right.
For some things, like some of the more domestic, like Ethan Allen produces in the U.S., so they also produce some stuff in Mexico, so it's very close. But those are the main countries, maybe Bangladesh for some apparel. So those Asian countries where labor is still relatively inexpensive, I think that's where they move. Yeah.
It's interesting that you talk about Vietnam. So Vietnam has been a huge focus for us, especially on a energy consumption, because they seem to be the kind of the natural move, because they hate Americans, but they hate the Chinese more. And they have they do have a very, they have a great labor force. They have a lot of ports, a lot of great areas to come in and out of, but they've always been short on electricity. And electricity in terms of building out the grid has always been a big focus. So it's going to be interesting to see how this kind of evolves over time. But shifting back towards the U.S., when you talk about curbside pickup, contact delivery, I mean, what other methods have you seen or heard about that could maybe minimize some of this contact that is being looked at in terms of kind of fulfilling those deliveries?
So minimizing contact with the store and the consumer directly?
Yes.
Versus besides curbside, you're seeing buy online, ship from store, where basically retailers are using their actual physical locations as distribution centers.
Okay.
So that shortens the last mile typically, because I can send it from the one right next to your house in Long Island versus the DC in New Jersey. So that is one option besides curbside, or having them actually pick it up. And otherwise, retailers do partner with their vendors in many cases, and it's shipped directly from the vendor to the end consumer. Okay. Even if it's purchased on a retailer's website.
Yeah. It's funny because when we look at these different things and we go through, diesel consumption, trucking, shipping, rail, it just seems that, you talked about the issue since 2008 on margin, and guys trying to do as much as possible to take some of that margin out. And you've seen that in rail. Like rail wasn't great in 2019. It was good in 2018. Wasn't great in 2019. Obviously, 2020 is terrible. And it just seems like there's going to remain that pain because you've had this optimization. So, distillate became an issue for us in terms of just diesel in 2019. And it doesn't seem like, even if we start to get back to something normal, it seems like some of these things you're talking about can remain because you're saving costs, you're maximizing your supply chain. And it's just that they're going to have to do that to survive. And let's be honest, consumers are lazy. If I don't have to leave my house, why am I going to leave my house? And it just seems like there's opportunity there within that construct. And the e-commerce is interesting and how that kind of builds out. When you're looking at overall flow in terms of dollars moving into different directions, I mean, how much do you think e-commerce could eat away at bricks and mortar, or is it going to just kind of be this? Could the pie get bigger, or is it just going to be a reshift of who gets a piece of the pie?
In my view, I think it's a bit more of the latter. You'll probably see increased digital penetration this year because of COVID, and it'll probably stick. So right now it's about maybe 13 to 15% of total retail is digital, approximately. So let's say the penetration increases slightly, but I still think a majority of the retail will be done in store. But the way that the retailers adjust will be based on who their consumer is and how that consumer views what is convenient.
Right.
And so in many cases, what that means, because convenience is different for me and for you, it requires them to have these multiple fulfillment options, which may not be the best from an economic point of view, but again, is a necessity to be in business. But I don't see that e-commerce will completely take over bricks and mortar retail, because people enjoy the experience of going in. And a lot of times you buy something online if you know there's a store, because that makes returns even easier.
Right.
Because the return cycle is a huge pain point for consumers.
And that's a great point. And when you're looking at, some of these people not going into the store, using, curbside delivery, how much is typically generated in point of purchase, where you're walking through the line and you're like, oh, I needed that. And then you grab it, not even thinking, and it's $3 to you because it's, anything from a screwdriver that's on sale, or, some random item as you're leaving that your kid might grab that you may not do now because you're not in that store. I mean, how much of that could be pain, and that kind of pads margin that you just won't have, especially this year?
Yeah, I don't have the exact percentage. I don't think it's a very big portion of a retailer's sales, but it's definitely a very high margin sale, really is what it is. And if it's a good experience for someone like Ulta, for example, their whole checkout line is full of little travel size products and things like that people love. So I feel like by category, they probably lose a lot of this impulse buy, because now we can, but we weren't able to go into the store. We just do digital. But I think it's more just about the experience of being online. And if you're not going with your kids and they're not picking up that candy bar, you just lose that high margin sale. So it might force a change in the way the cash wrap looks.
Okay.
Make it more efficient. Maybe you have more self-checkout, the different ways that they might have to do it to optimize it for safety and to this new behavior.
Now, when going back to, the earlier point that you made in terms of payments from the pickup from unemployment, the additional cushion that we got, the $1,200 check, plus whatever you got for having a child, as that runs out, and I think today we printed about 19.5 million continuing claims, another 1.4 million of new unemployment. I mean, when does that start to really kind of weigh down, where you see those dollars go away because it's been absorbed into debt, into food, into whatever, and now there's concern of, am I going to be employed, and will I have that money, and I have to kind of pull back?
I still think you'll start to see a little bit in August, and as we go into early fall, particularly, there's a second wave. Most of the people who've been pulled out of getting unemployment benefits were these wage earners or those who were furloughed. But in many cases, the retailers who furloughed these workers are also laying off a portion of their workers and closing stores because it's not economical anymore. So if we have another wave, I think that is a huge risk. And I'm still not sure that those who have not been called back, this 19 million, I'm not sure what their prospects are for employment going forward, given that everyone is trying to reassess where their business is and try to figure out what the underlying demand is for their product. So I think it could be a while before you see that, and the $1,200 will run out very soon if it hasn't already. So that again pushes people away from discretionary, nice to have things and just what they need to survive, essentially.
Okay. Yeah, because we had the beginning of June, we had some decent data come out. People got excited, but is that really where that lion's share of $1,200 was spent? Is it already gone, or is it something where July could see a reverberation of that because June, July, and then August is where you start to see real numbers? How are you kind of looking at timing in terms of when we can start to see look, it's all baked in now. Now this is real. This is where the trend is, take away COVID and just thinking about spending.
Yeah. So I think there was definitely a boost when people first got their check. And, we talked about the high savings rate. So people had a little bit of savings because they weren't able to spend. So I think you'll see that in June and July. And remember, during this period, you're also seeing a heavily promotional environment. So while you couldn't get this top line growth, most retailers probably will have very poor margins coming out of Q2 and into Q3. So it's not always just about the top line. But I think once you get past July and new product starts coming in and you're not getting the unemployment and people have to pay their rent and all the necessities, I think that you'll really start to see the squeeze, and you'll see the results, I think, in Q3 and when you see people talking about how back to school goes. Because typically we have the saying, how it goes back to school is how it goes holiday. Right. And if you don't see that, and there are so many exogenous factors that it's even hard to figure out how strong it will be. Like, are we going to actually go back to school? Or am I going to be teaching my children at home so they don't need any clothes for school? So there's so many things like that that have the potential to impact more negative than positive the way that these retailers do in the back to school timeframe. Right. So
when you're looking at this, and because we're always trying to figure out what is the consumer going to do, how are they going to look around, and you see Home Depot, Lowe's, and people that delayed building the shed or the deck or fixing something are now taking this opportunity to do that. Is that bump going to go away, or is that something that you think can kind of be relatively sticky as we go forward? When you look at Tractor Supply, you look at Home Depot, Lowe's in terms of just what they're delivering versus some of the others as people try to just get back to basics.
Yeah, so I think that actually the home improvement guys and Tractor Supply are in really a great position from a defensive standpoint because people have been at home, they're stuck at home, the weather has improved, and that's really what's been driving these sales at home improvement, because people are like, I'm here, let me fix up my house, let me do my garden. 2/3 of home improvement sales are actually break fix versus discretionary. So with more than, a huge portion of the homes, 40% of the homes over 40 years old, or it's such a high number, things are constantly breaking. So to their defense, they have that going for them in terms of constantly getting that consumer to get back into the store. And when people are working at home, you're seeing improvements even at home furnishings and decor, because the environment in which you are at makes a big difference, to personal happiness. So you're seeing strength in those two categories. And I think that persists as long as we are sort of still in this semi-lockdown from a work perspective, and could persist even further because probably more people will permanently start to work from home now that it's sort of been cleared as a thing that people can manage. Where you see more risk is some of the things that required, big gatherings, maybe like party supplies, apparel, business clothing, that kind of thing, where there is no occasion coming up anytime soon for someone to be incentivized to buy that or even go on vacation, clothes for vacation. So I think those are the categories where, there's just more risk, because why do people need it right now? And those are the ones we're watching. And you've seen them. They're already having trouble, and they're trying to make their way. Right.
Yeah. Those vacations, those fun things that used to happen prior to all this, and not to put you on the spot in terms of, locations, but obviously the Northeast, California were the first ones in. And, we all know how New York City spends, how tourism, brings in a lot of new money, where they purchase, and Tiffany's and other. But now you're starting to see this really kind of catch fire in Texas, Arizona, Florida, some of these other regions. I mean, how important is it for some of these, national and global retailers for the tourist that comes in and buys, some of these big urban areas that attract both tourists as well as, wealthy locals that are willing to spend versus some of these other areas that are a bit more, broad and don't have the same kind of income demographic that some of the other places have. How can that kind of be balanced, or what are you thinking in terms of the impact that could have on some of these, companies' bottom line?
I think that particularly those with the flagships in New York, so think Tiffany's and Macy's, tourism is actually a huge component of their top line. I think for Tiffany's at one point, it was just under 10% of total sales from the New York flagship alone. So it has a huge impact when tourism slows. And you already saw that partially starting when there was the trade fight with China and the Chinese slowed their travel to the U.S. There was a huge impact, not just to the retailers, but also to the broader New York market in terms of who's buying luxury housing, who's buying the second and third homes in Vail and Miami. They all see a compression when those guys aren't traveling. Similarly, someplace like Disney, where now the cases are spiking, Disney World is obviously a huge travel hub, and the bulk of their revenue is probably from tourists versus local economy. And so for them, I think it's a huge loss, not only just for them, but probably also for, if you think of Orlando, for example, you have Universal and Disney, they probably employ, I'm guessing, like 70% of Orlando in some form or capacity. So if the tourism stops or travel doesn't come back anytime in the next 6 months, that's, I could see a lot of unemployment going up in those areas, at least in the near term, because how can they continue to keep up spending if they're not able to get the consumer? And some of it is very political, right? If Europeans aren't really wanting the U.S. citizens to go to Europe because of the way COVID is handled, we could retaliate in the same way. So some of the stuff that's done for politics could have a really negative impact on the way that these retailers function and on the broader markets that rely on, foreign tourists to spend, right? Because we've heard that even from a company, Restoration Hardware in 2016, when tourism slowed from Brazil and China, they really took a hit because they're selling high-end furniture that many people use to furnish their second and third homes. And when those guys don't come in, it has a huge impact. So
yeah, it's a great point when you think back to 2016 and some of these other points when tourism dipped or whenever you had something that really impacted. But some of these retailers have always been agnostic during a downturn, because some of this the rich can still spend because they have the money. But when you talked about unemployment and something that we focused on is that unemployment is moving up the ranks. Now instead of just the hourly worker, you're getting the general manager of the hotel. You're getting people who are in the mid-tier executive level that are getting paid $400,000, $500,000. That how are you going to replace that? Like, is that job gone? Are you going to accept a lower wage? And it just seems that some of these higher end retailers could get impacted. And that am I right to think that that's a good bellwether to think about how well that individual is doing and how that's going to kind of affect the market going forward?
I think so. And you'll hear a lot of, on different retail calls, people asking if they're seeing consumers trade down or trade up. And I think you're right. That job that maybe is getting squeezed out at this point is really hard, if not impossible, to find the similar job or to replace. And in many cases, given the supply that's out there now, I'd suspect that in order to get a job, you would have to take some sort of pay cut and just take what you could get. So I think, yes, for many of these higher level, I would think maybe like the tier of Nordstrom's and Bloomingdale's. So maybe not Saks, Fifth Avenue, Neiman level, but maybe just right under that, where you were getting the people making $400,000 or $500,000 sending their kids to the local private school. I think that's where you'll start to see pressure. And it could be a permanent loss. Well, permanent meaning at least the next few years, because I don't see that type of job market coming back. I mean, in New York alone, the finance industry has been really hit in 2008 and even now. So there's really no comparable salary in another industry at that, in order to maintain that same level of spending.
Now, and when you think of those, like you describe the malls as, A and B, and you have some of these anchor stores going away or maybe shrinking their footprint. I mean, how do you backfill? Like, what do you backfill it with? Like, how do you readjust that?
Yeah, it's hard, and it's what every landlord is really trying to do. And a lot of what they had been doing was adding fitness and entertainment and food, because those are things that generally drive traffic and frequency. So right now, until gyms can fully reopen, that's unfortunately been a headwind for them. But restaurants and anything experience that they can add that besides movie theaters, like something that you do, like I mentioned, this indoor skydiving or
skiing,
in Dubai, they have this skiing in the mall. Yeah. Something that you can do that makes it a destination, I think is what they're trying to do. And in many cases, the other option I've heard is trying to figure out like, hey, how can we reconfigure our center such that maybe we take one of the empty anchor spaces and make it like a distribution center where everybody buys online and pickups from one location. We can make it more efficient and easier for the consumer. So I know they're playing around with different ideas as to how they can use the space, and monetize it. Okay.
So last topic before we let you go back to your life. When you talked about the work attire, and when we think about work from home and how are retailers considering the work from home life? I mean, we've already heard that some companies are going to hold this through 2020, and then reassess in 2021, summer, September. But regardless, it's good. It seems to be that we can function with a work from home society to some degree. I mean, does that impact sales? Like, is that going to impact the way people market in terms of the way that they're looking to get those individuals to purchase? Like you said, the suit they may not need because it's $600, and why do I need a suit? Yeah. And it's something that's interesting. And I mean, what are you thinking about? How are people really trying to plan for that?
So there's two things. If you think of like nice occasions like proms and weddings, I assume at some point they'll come back in some form. But in the near term, those type of retailers are obviously going to struggle. Any kind of bridal store, tuxedos, suits, and workwear, I think, is somewhat in the same category because we were already skewing towards more casual just as a secular trend. Right. And now you're seeing that people, if they have any nice clothes, it's really from the top up for their Zoom call. I mean, honestly, so. Are
you wearing shorts? Come on, let's be fair.
Not shorts. But so I think it does make a difference as to what product you're trying to sell. So for example, Gap owns Banana Republic, and that tends to be more wear to work clothes. And now they're trying to make the assortment more casual to drive sales with that same aesthetic. So I think you're going to see that have to happen because, even if we do go back to the office, it won't be the same number of people going back to the office. And we were already moving to a more casual environment anyway. So I think it really forces them to have to change their styling.
And when you think about, like you said, Banana Republic and, shifting down to Old Navy and some of these other, I mean, do companies that have that optionality in the supply chain benefit? Because if you're not going to Banana, then you're going to go to Old Navy and I'm going to get you regardless. It's just going to be at a different margin point.
Possibly. I don't think there's for Banana Republic and Old Navy, for example, I think their products tend to be pretty different, at least in quality from my understanding. So I think it would be hard to get the switch there. It's more like Old Navy is a value retailer for the family. So someone like them and a mass like a Target maybe would be taking sales from like a Macy's for children's clothing and things like that. And I think that for Banana Republic and any of its, more direct rivals, it's just that they're all going to be fighting for less share, basically share of wallet.
Well, this was all great. I mean, is there anything you can leave us with? Anything that I should have asked, didn't ask? Any point that you think is relevant that we should talk about in the last few minutes?
I just think, I guess the only thing I would say about actually that, consumers' behavior during COVID itself was how it was really an opportunity for consumers to try new brands based on availability. It goes back to your supply chain. So I think my biggest takeaway from this whole process is the importance of the supply chain. And I don't think retailers were giving it enough attention. They were in the sense that they wanted to, get the cost down, but I don't think that the actual understanding how to manage what inventory you have and where it is very important, because you lose people's attention. And once they're used to buying a new brand, you might lose them permanently. So I just think that was something I got from the Amazon experience. Like, they actually lost some consumers from going there as their first choice, even now that everything is back to normal, because the supply wasn't there. And so to me, that's a big thing. You have to have what you're trying to sell, or you might lose the customer.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Seema. I really appreciate the time. You can see her. Well, thank you. You can see her company's website. We'll have it available. Please subscribe. Thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Rossano. And Seema, thanks again. It was a great time.
Thank you. Thank you.